Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm Dmitri Alperovitch, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitics think tank in Washington, D.C. Today I'm pleased to talk to Vincent Chao, a former chief of staff of Taiwan's National Security Council and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and now a politician in the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, in Taipei. Vincent, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dmitri. It was great meeting you back in Munich, and I'm happy to be on this show. So I'm currently working as a counselor in Taipei City Council, my first elected position since last November. But previous to that, I served as our political director in Taiwan's representative office in Washington, D.C., and prior to that in various capacities in government. I've been with President Tsai since 2013, helping out both in her think tank and her foundation and ultimately her administration. So it's great to talk to you. It's great to kind of hear your thoughts as well, Dmitri, about the situation we're in, as well as sort of outlooks in terms of what are the best ways to maintain security here in the Taiwan Strait.
Well, thank you for having us. And for our listeners, we're sort of deviating from our regular scheduled programming, talking a lot about the war in Ukraine, to talk about the other major conflict that is potentially looming in the world in the Indo-Pacific, and that is the potential that hopefully never occurs, but of China's invasion of Taiwan. And as you mentioned, Vincent, we met each other at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year and had some great interactions on some of these issues. I thought it would be great to have you on just to explain to our audience the Taiwanese perspective. We often hear about what the U.S. may or may not do. We talk about what China may or may decide to do with regards to Taiwan, but we rarely get the sense of how the Taiwanese people and politicians thinking about this challenge, this really existential challenge that they may be facing. And I thought it would be good to start with a little bit of a primer for our audience, just very briefly on the political system in Taiwan. As you mentioned, you're a politician, the DPP, the currently ruling party in Taiwan that won the election in 2016. President Tsai, the current president of Taiwan, is a member of that party. It is a party that is a little bit more forward-leaning on not quite independence, or at least announcing
building
independence.
a stronger Taiwanese identity.
Building a stronger Taiwanese identity. Thank you. Very well put. But then you have the other major party in Taiwan, the KMT, the Kuomintang, that had ruled Taiwan since 1949, when the Nationalist Party lost on the mainland to the communists and fled to Taiwan and initially had a dictatorship. There was now a democratic movement out of which the DPP had emerged in the 80s and a slow democratization process in the 90s. But KMT remains a major power in Taiwan, and there are elections coming up next year where the current vice president from the DPP is expected to run against the KMT. Explain to us a little bit about the current political environment and the positions of those parties, because KMT, a lot of people think is sort of pro-Beijing. Maybe that's a little bit too much, but they're certainly more accommodating to China. And just explain where they're coming from and where DPP sees things from.
So it's quite interesting. When I was in D.C., there was a growing trend in universities across the U.S. to talk about Taiwan history, and their college-level courses taught about it now. So what we're going to try to do is squeeze a semester's worth of classes into the next few minutes we have here. So it's going to be quite complicated, and it's going to be a short roller coaster ride, so just bear with me. But the whole history begins really in 1911 when the Qing dynasty was overthrown and the Republic of China was established. The Republic of China was established, but immediately ran into headwinds, both in terms of domestic instability as well as the Second World War, and then ultimately a communist uprising. So the communist uprising succeeded in throwing out the ruling authoritarian party of the Republic of China, which was the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, out of mainland China, and then they fled to Taiwan in 1949. Now, Taiwan is also an interesting case study in the sense that it was only returned to the Republic of China in 1945 after defeat of imperialist Japan, and Taiwan had been a colony of Japan since the late 19th century. So Taiwan had just returned to the ROC in 1945, and then the KMT, the Chinese Nationalist Party, lost the Civil War to the communists and fled here in 1949. So already you can see that there is a mismatch of identity politics here. In 1949, the Kuomintang relocated their central government here to Taiwan, and then they set up an authoritarian dictatorship that had ruled Taiwan through martial law all the way into the 1980s. Following Taiwan's economic miracle in the 70s and 80s, there were a growing chorus of support for Taiwan's democracy and freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and so forth. And ultimately, martial law was lifted in the late 1980s, and then we saw kind of successive local and then central government elections in the years following. And so in 1996, we held our first ever direct presidential election through universal suffrage. So there was a whole process there. The DPP, which is the party I belong to, really came about through the process of democratization in the 80s and 90s. There were a bunch of freedom-minded lawyers, professionals, and urban folks and intellectuals that had advocated not only for a stronger Taiwanese identity, but also this idea that we needed democracy and we needed freedom, and we wanted to see the end of this authoritarian rule. So how this is manifested in years past is that, so in 1996, we held our first ever presidential election. In 2000, we held our first transfer of power, which is peaceful, from the KMT to the DPP. In 2008, power transferred back to the KMT. And then in 2016, the DPP, led by the current president, President Taiwan, won again. Now, this is the history of these two political parties have manifested itself into two different political ideologies, particularly in respect to cross-strait. So on the KMT side, they still hold on to this notion that they represent all of China, that the ROC, Republic of China, never gave up its claim on China, and that Taiwan is a part of China. But this China, in their view, is this Republic of China that essentially had ended in 1949 and then had lost international recognition in 1972 to 79.
And Vincent, certainly that was true throughout the dictatorship era, but that is still true today, that the regular sort of party members of the KMT still believe that it's one China and they one day will rule Beijing.
Not necessarily one day rule Beijing, but the party doctrine right now on the KMT side is that there is but one China, and that this China, in their interpretation, is the Republic of China. And so in a sense, they deny the existence of the People's Republic of China. And in the past, this haziness has allowed them to negotiate a series of agreements, in their view, with China, for example, in the so-called 92 consensus, which was a formula that suggested that both sides, the Chinese, the PRC side and the ROC side, agreed to this idea that there's one China with different interpretations. And that formed the basis of the KMT's interactions with Beijing. Now, the DPP holds on to an entirely different view, because we believe that this is just so divorced from reality that there's just no way it makes sense in the 21st century. I mean, the PRC obviously is the PRC, and this is, their existence, I think, is hard to deny in the current landscape and geopolitical sense. So the DPP essentially believes that, yes, the ROC is a sovereign, independent country, but the sovereignty of the ROC is rested in the 23 million people of Taiwan. Essentially, that the ROC and the PRC, Republic of China, and the People's Republic of China, are not under each other's jurisdictions. They're two essentially different entities here, and so the DPP, believes in a sense that yes, the Taiwanese people have chosen through elections again and again that where our sovereignty lies, and our sovereignty is in Taiwan, and there is no need to redeclare, for example, the Republic of China or other de jure methods of sovereignty or independence, because essentially we are an independent and sovereign country, and we have been for decades past. And our formal name is Republic of China, but most people see us as Taiwan, including domestically. So, I mean, you can't. There are people in the media that try to portray the DPP as, very radical pro-independence, de jure independence, people that want to upset the status quo. I think President Tsai in particular has been very, very careful on this issue, and what she's tried to build up is sort of a consensus within Taiwan that we are a democracy, and that, we are already an independent sovereign country called the Republic of China. And there's no need to declare de jure independence, but we are separated. We are different from the People's Republic of China. We are not under each other's jurisdiction.
And to be clear, the reason that people may be concerned about this is that the fear is that if Taiwan proclaims independence, that would give Beijing an excuse and potentially even force their hand through internal politics in Beijing to actually launch an invasion.
Well, that's precisely it, Dmitry. So, in terms of all of these conceptualizations of what we look like, what our national identity is, to a certain extent, they're influenced and they're shaped by how we feel reactions across the strait could go. And we have to keep in mind that we do have a neighbor that is, 60 times our size in terms of population, that has a huge army, huge navy, has, hundreds of missiles aimed directly at Taiwan. It has made it a political commitment of theirs to invade Taiwan through military force if they feel that their political situation is jeopardized, or if they feel that Taiwan is moving too far away. So both parties have had to find ways of existing sort of under this landscape. And so on the KMT side, they tend to think that the best way is to acknowledge this idea that we're part of China, that Taiwan is part of China, and the whole China, including kind of mainland China. And that the best way is to discussions and negotiations and dialogue with Beijing. On the DPP side, we just don't buy that because, well, number one, we are a sovereign independent country. We've been called a republic now. We have our own navy, army, air force. We have a constitution. We make our own laws. There's never been a PLA soldier in the history of kind of cross-strait tensions that's ever stepped foot here on Taiwan. And at the same time, we believe that we should keep Beijing at arm's length because we understand sort of their military intentions towards Taiwan, and we feel the best way of protecting ourselves isn't to lower our guard and engage in, discussions that may or may not bear fruit, but discussions that are nevertheless based on these preconditions set by Beijing. We believe that the best way to maintain peace is to have a robust defense, to have great relations with international partners, democracies around the world, to ensure that the international community feels a stake kind of in the defense of Taiwan. So these are two completely different ways of thinking about the cross-strait situation. And this is sort of the main differentiation between political parties here in Taiwan.
So I guess the key question that the Americans are wondering, that policymakers here in D.C. are wondering, particularly looking at the events of last year in Europe, is Taiwan going to be Ukraine? So should the unthinkable happen and should China launch an invasion, how many Taiwanese people are going to pick up arms and defend their country in the way that Ukraine has done? And I'll tell you, Vincent, before you start answering, is that I've had a number of interactions with various folks in Taiwan over the years that have been saying to me on one hand that they want to be an independent country, they don't view themselves as part of China, but on the other hand, basically saying that unless they get X, Y, and Z, certain weapon systems, etc., from U.S., they'll just give up. And I look at that and I say, well, the Ukrainians didn't give up just because they didn't get all the weapon systems right away from the West. They got some of the weapon support, but they certainly didn't get the Patriots and the tanks and the HIMARS and everything else that they're getting now, but they still chose to fight for their country. And when you look at the numbers, it is a country, as you said, of 23 million people, at least 5 to 6 million of them are military-age males. So it seems to me that if you sort of become the porcupine that everyone wants you to become, sort of an Israel or a Finland, where you mobilize and you highly train your military-capable population, invasion really becomes an impossibility for China. The numbers are just going to be too great for them to succeed. So the root of the question is, will Taiwan fight? And if so, why aren't we seeing a lot of the preparations that you would expect to see, given the threat environment?
So to really think about this problem, we got to look at, I think, Ukraine back in 2014 rather than 2022. And so the invasion of Ukraine had really started in 2014 after Maidan, with Russia essentially annexing Crimea and parts of the Donbas. And so you could see that prior to that phase, the Ukrainians not really believed that Russia was a threat. And in fact, prior to Maidan in 2014, a majority of people actually thought Russia was a great neighbor, at least for many people. And so in terms of comparing Taiwan to Ukraine in 2014, we're a lot more advanced in a sense that we kind of know the threat we're under. We're making reforms. We're making preparations. We're not waiting for parts of Taiwan's offshore islands to be annexed by force to start. And so, we have a running start compared to Ukraine in 2014. Now, whether that running start is going to be enough to deter a full-on invasion, I think is the primary question people have in mind. I will first bring up another point as well that's worth thinking about as we delve into this answer, which is identity politics in Taiwan. It's as complicated, if not more complicated, in Ukraine. Ukraine, you had a majority. You had a lot of people, the majority in sort of the eastern regions that were Russian speakers. You have a president that spoke Russian as his mother tongue. In Taiwan, all of us, 90%, with the exception of some Hakka, Aboriginal, and some other smaller ethnic groups, speak Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, and identity politics here. There's a majority of people that belong to the Kuomintang, the KMT, that believe in some sense that we are Chinese, and that that there is no differentiation between Taiwan and China. Now, the majority of DPP supporters don't necessarily see it that way, but certainly a large number of KMT supporters do. And so what you essentially have is you have political parties that are based on political ideology in one sense, but also based in some sense on ethnicity and on national identity and on upbringing and on how you see Taiwan's history. So anyways, I just wanted to put that in context because people always see Taiwan as this completely unified but bewildered actor in this, in the sense that, yes, Taiwan should see the threat every day, but how come nobody does anything? But I wanted to share that because that's only representative of part of Taiwan society. There's a part of Taiwan society that doesn't see the threat and doesn't believe that they're a threat, and believes that maybe even if both sides were unified, that this would be, consistent with their perceptions of national identity.
So I just want to zoom in on that. So you're saying that there's a significant portion of the Taiwanese population that would be okay with the Chinese Communist Party ruling Taiwan and ruling their lives.
I didn't say significant, but I did say that there were a number. And it's true. I mean, if you look at their unification parties here in Taiwan, there's the New Party in Taiwan that advocates for unification. The KMT, advocates for unification kind of in the long run as well. Now all of them profess to say that well, nobody wants to live under communist rule. But, to be realistic, if you're talking about unification, it's not going to be the other way around. I mean, there's going to be one big actor and one smaller actor, and trust me, we're not going to be the big one. So my point being is that it's a difficult and complex issue here in Taiwan, and so there is no 100% unified voice. And in a sense, that didn't exist in Ukraine prior to 2022 either, and that certainly does not exist here in Taiwan today. But I will say this: the majority of people, kind of across the political spectrum, there are points of consensus, and the points of consensus is that, number one, we do live in a free and democratic society. Number two, we would like to protect this free and democratic society and our way of life. Number three, we don't want to see war. So how do you make the best actions with all of this in mind, right? I think that's the question for policymakers here in Taiwan. So back to your question itself, so the DPP was elected in 2016, and the DPP does have a view that's different from the KMT. The DPP does believe in many senses that defense is the best deterrent, and that in the absence of cross-strait dialogue, that the best way of ensuring Taiwan's survival and to maintain sort of the points I've outlined above, keeping Taiwan free, democratic, our way of life, and so forth, is to enhance deterrence. So the DPP is moving on deterrence. And so we've increased the defense budget from about 1.7% to 2.4%. We've reintroduced conscription of a year. We've bought kind of new weaponry, both domestic and from overseas. We've reoriented our military strategy from a more conventional approach to an asymmetric approach. And all of these actions are ongoing. I think the legitimate question, if I could say that, is not necessarily whether Taiwan is moving in the right direction, is whether we're moving fast enough in the right direction. Like we're increasing defense budget, conscription, new weaponry, asymmetric tactics. All of this is right. But the question is, are we moving wholesale, kind of in a holistic way, fast enough? I think that is the question. Now, to the last point you made about the Taiwanese people's willingness to fight, I'll say it like this. Like, again, If you draw comparisons to Ukraine, I mean, the will of the Ukrainian people really shone through after they were invaded, not before they were invaded. I mean, before they were invaded, you had people rotating in and out of the Donbass. You had 600,000, conscripts and troops at one point. But all of this was because of the threat, not before the threat. And so it becomes
to your
it's
point,
very hard.
To your point, Russia took Crimea without firing a shot, and a lot of the Ukrainian soldiers who were based in Crimea not only surrendered but basically joined the Russian military at the time.
So the point is, it's actually very hard to mobilize a populace in peacetime, and it's very hard to mobilize a populace when the threat is not pressing. And to be fair, the threat is not pressing today. It will be pressing. I mean, it could very likely be pressing in a few years. But I think given the circumstances, Taiwan has done the best we can do. Maybe not the best, but we're doing what we can politically at this point to mobilize ourselves in sort of the peacetime scenario we're in right now.
There's been a lot of concern in the United States in recent years about Russia and disinformation and whether the Russians have been able to influence our elections or not in past times. There is a lot of concern now about what China may be doing with disinformation, misinformation in Taiwan. How much of that is truly a concern? How active do you think China is in that sphere, and how effective it might be?
So, number one, absolutely a huge concern. Number two, China's absolutely in this sphere. And number three, our fear for others is that Taiwan is a test basket, and we're seeing increased actions, Chinese gray zone tactics, Chinese infiltration tactics, Chinese disinformation, kind of in democratic societies other than ours as well, such as Australia, has been a huge target. Canada election tampering has been a big story there for the past couple of weeks. But certainly, I mean, it's an exportable sort of set of actions, and successes here and successes elsewhere will translate into successes kind of in other countries as well.
And what are you seeing? Is it overt sort of propaganda for the KMT against the DPP, or is there some nuance, some covert actions? What are you actually seeing on the ground?
So it's actually very sophisticated. So if you look at sort of decades ago when this whole propaganda war started, it really consisted of kind of like loudspeakers, like position on kind of the shore opposite our offshore islands in like Fujian province, and they would mount these huge letters and have like loudspeakers blaring all the time, like communist ideology. And now in the 21st century, it's so much more sophisticated at that, and they're finely tuned to kind of exploit weaknesses within free and democratic societies. So case in point, just recently actually there was somebody that was employed by Radio Sputnik in DC that made a satirical post about Biden having this plan to essentially destroy Taiwan, to leave Taiwan like a wasteland if China were to invade. And it was obviously, I mean, satire. I mean, you could tell by past posts, you could tell by kind of this history that was satire.
And by the way, Radio Sputnik is a Russian state-owned media.
That's right. And so there was this pro-China Beijing politician here in Taiwan, and pro-Beijing in the sense that he is very pro this idea of one China, and he frequently espouses kind of Chinese talking points, PRC talking points here in Taiwan that amplified this and gave it legitimacy and said that Biden actually does have this plan to destroy Taiwan, and that, we should be very wary of it and we shouldn't trust these Americans. And then the kind of the media outlets that have traditionally been more pro-Beijing talking points came out and amplified that again and gave it additional layer of legitimacy. And then the final kick of this is then like Chinese officials started commenting on this. So you saw like both the Taiwan Affairs Office as well as I think it was the Foreign Ministry of the PRC come out and say, well, this is certainly something that should be of concern to Taiwan compatriots, this idea that Americans have of destroying Taiwan. And so it just became this whole layered approach to disinformation that allowed this whole thing to proliferate in Taiwanese society for days, if not weeks. And what ended up happening was that some people believe this. I mean, some people won't believe it. Some people never believe it, but some people will believe this, and some people will take this at face value. And this additionally, I think, damages kind of U.S. credibility for absolutely nothing the U.S. did here in Taiwan. And these are examples that, I mean, this is a recent example that happened about 2 weeks ago, but these are things that happen all the time here in Taiwan because they exploit the free press, they exploit free speech, they exploit this idea of attaching kind of nonsensical claims to people with purported legitimacy. So that's kind of on the media aspect.
Well,
but
let me just ask about that, Vincent, because
Sure.
one of the things that the Russians have learned really well from the Soviet Union era is that the more effective propaganda is not the one that's pushing your own ideology, because they found out over the course of decades during the communist era that very few people wanted to live under the Soviet Union or communist regime, and that propaganda, no matter how much you push it out, is not going to work. But what they're doing now is not necessarily promoting the virtues of the Putin government and recommending that everyone else adopt the same government, but trying to take everyone else down. So it's not about promoting themselves, it's about finding fissures and taking down the West, taking down America, and so forth. So are the Chinese taking the same methodology where it's not necessarily about promoting Beijing, but trying to discredit the West
Trying
and
to
Western
discredit the
support?
West. Yeah, absolutely. And keep in mind, they do it with always a veneer of truth. Like it's not it's to us, it's completely irrational. But to people that have already kind of opened the door a bit to this irrationality, then the door swings a bit open. Like even if they don't trust this 100%, it sells doubt. So this feeds into this idea of what many pro Beijing talking point outlets have said here in Taiwan, which is that Ukraine is a victim of kind of great power competition between Russia and China. Like the Ukrainians are suffering because of decisions the U.S. made rather than those decision makers in Moscow. And Taiwan shouldn't be a pawn in that. And with this whole example shouldn't be replicated here in Taiwan. So that's a talking point that's already out there. That's been fed for weeks and months after the Ukrainian conflict started. And on another point of that, this idea that things are outside of our control, and that really it's the West that's setting Taiwan up for conflict, and the West wants our semiconductor technologies. They want to use Taiwan as a bulwark against China, but Taiwan is unwilling. There's a lot of kind of weird out there, to be honest, Dmitri. But my point is that everything feeds together. Everything is self-reinforcing. And so this idea about Biden destroying Taiwan, to us, it's completely far-fetched. But to people that have already started to accept this idea of great power competition, of Taiwan being a pawn, of Taiwan kind of being stuck in the middle without any agency of its own, the blah, 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 then it starts to feel like this is reinforcing that idea and that, this is a legitimate area of discourse. So that's the problem, Dmitri, that democratic societies face, in Taiwan. But I think you will start to see this in the United States as well in a growing sense in terms of Chinese propaganda and Chinese ways of influencing public opinion.
So, Vincent, you mentioned semiconductors, and there's been this idea for 20 years or so in Taiwan of this concept of a silicon shield. The idea that because Taiwan, primarily through one of its companies, TSMC, which is the largest manufacturer of chips in the world, both advanced chips as well as more mature or foundational chips, as I call them, because it has so much expertise and so much production capacity that not just the West, but China relies on, that it's going to have some sort of deterrent effect, and China won't invade Taiwan because there's a silicon shield, presumably with the assumption that should there be an invasion, that the Chinese will not get the equipment and the technologies that's in those fabs because they'll get destroyed either through unintentional action during warfare, because these are really sensitive technologies. So if you have sudden power cuts, for example, you may damage equipment and production capacity, but also maybe through intentional acts as well. And now I'm hearing that there's some concern in Taiwan that maybe is being promoted by China, maybe is spreading on its own, that because the West and particularly the United States are looking at this reliance that we have on Taiwan in the semiconductor space and trying to reduce it through our own investments in the CHIPS Act here domestically, trying to incentivize companies like TSMC and others from abroad to come in and build facilities here in the United States, that is reducing Taiwan's ability to deter China and reducing the effectiveness of Silicon Shield. Is that real? Is that a feeling that's widespread among the population? And what do you personally think about Silicon Shield?
Oh, I to be honest, Dimitri, and my position may differ from others in my political party, but I personally feel the Silicon Shield is a complete farce. Like, it just does not exist. And there's a rational reason behind why Silicon Shield does not exist. Is because assuming that a chip shortage, and keep in mind, Taiwan, we don't necessarily dominate all chips, but we dominate high-end chips. So like most high-end chips are made here in Taiwan, the 3 nanometers and below and so forth. But assuming, for example, a chip shortage, particularly of the high-end kind, damages everyone. It damages the global economy. Smartphones, cars, electronics, TVs, everything is impacted. Then the question becomes, who has a high tolerance for pain? And I'm not sure democratic societies are going to win that over a communist society like China. So again, that's assuming this hurts everybody equally, but I have no reason to see why this will not hurt everybody equally, because shortages of cars, whether in America or China, shortages of iPhones or other high-end kind of smartphones in US or China or the West, blah, blah, it hurts everybody. There's going to be huge consumer backlash, and I'm just not sure, and I'll emphasize that I'm not sure that the US, and in fact, I don't believe that the US and other Western countries can take that pain more effectively than a command control economy like the PRC. And so this idea that the PRC will not invade Taiwan because it causes pain, to me, just does not make sense, because the Chinese have shown incredible tolerance for pain. They've shown incredible tolerance for self-inflicted pain. COVID is one example.
Zero COVID.
After world zero COVID, dynamic zero COVID, but the world had moved on from COVID for an entire year and a half, while China was still locking people up in quarantine centers and shutting down entire swaths of their economy and closing down kind of Shanghai and many other kind of their frontline top tier cities and so forth. And they did this to fulfill a political mandate, which is to ensure that cases did not spike in their view before the 20th Party Congress, where Xi Jinping needed political legitimacy and political strength. And so there's little reason to believe, at least to make optimistic predictions, that the Chinese would feel that to achieve a larger national rejuvenation goal of unifying Taiwan, that they're not able to take pain. Like, that just, to me, boggles the mind. And especially if that pain, again, manifests in a much, much more pronounced way in Western societies, in a way where ultimately it could create dependence on China rather than the other way around.
Well, this is what I don't understand about this Silicon Shield argument, is that if you believe that China will not invade because of its dependence on Taiwan for chips, then it seems like the natural outcome from that perspective would be policy to deny China as much production of chips as possible. And yet you have major Taiwanese companies, including TSMC, but also others, building fabs, helping mainland Chinese to learn how to manufacture semiconductors, evolve their capabilities, because the process technology is ultimately what's really unique here. And you're, in fact, enabling China in some ways to reduce their dependence on you over the long term. So, in effect, Taiwan itself is contributing to this decreased deterrence, if it ever existed.
Well, Dmitry, that's not limited. This kind of short-sighted ideology is not limited to Taiwan. It's limited. It extends to every multinational that had to engage in tech sharing or kind of joint
ventures. I know, but Vincent, we're not in danger. The United States is not in danger of being invaded by China anytime soon. Taiwan is, right? So the perspective, it would seem to me, would be quite different in Taiwan, where if people think it's an existential threat, you'd be more worried about it than perhaps a multinational in California that's really not worried about that point.
Right. But the point is, the existentialist, this idea of an existentialist threat really just arose in the past couple of years. So what you referred to, for example, in kind of tech sharing and TSMC setting up plants, all of this took place decades ago, or if not a decade ago, when they believed truly, as with MNCs over the world, that China would become more free, democratic, have a free market economy, and engage in peaceful trade over the world. And sort of that, to be clear, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that there is a whole historical background behind why they decided to go to China. And in fact, Taiwan government policy, to a certain extent, even encouraged it at the time, having kind of lower tier chip manufacturers and chip plants and chip technologies go to China. Now, obviously, that has completely changed. And I think these chip manufacturers also know that. And so I struggle to find any kind of new major investment cases in China. But I think the bigger issue isn't really setting up the plans. I don't see that happening. I think the bigger issue is how much end-use monitoring our chip manufacturers are doing in China. So, for example, I think, and I'm making assumptions here, but I think assumptions that are based on educated material informative material that's out there, that there are chips from Taiwan that are going into PLA military systems, including missiles. And so how do you prevent that from happening? So, I mean, these are questions I think that Taiwan needs to confront head on, to be frank, Dmitri.
So let's talk about the military dimension here, because ultimately, if deterrence does fail and there is an invasion, whether or not U.S. comes to Taiwan's aid, and there are real questions about that. You do have President Biden on 4 occasions, at least publicly saying that we will come to Taiwan's defense, and on one occasion saying explicitly that he will send American troops to fight for Taiwan. But that aside, we're far away. Guam and Okinawa are our nearest territories, and if there is war, those initial days, you likely will have to stand on your own before we can even come to your defense. And there is a real question of, is Taiwan prepared for that fight, not just from a will perspective, but from a capability perspective? Because over the years, there's been a lot of military purchases of Western equipment that people sort of look at and scratch their heads at of, is that really going to contribute to a defense? So, for example, a big focus on buying M1 Abrams tank platforms, which on a small island that's, hilly island that's very urbanized as well, you don't see a big potential for tank battles and potentially in preventing airborne assault on port facilities or airports being a big contributor. There's a big focus on buying F-16s. There are, about a dozen airbase around the island whose runways could be destroyed with missile strikes in the first hours of the war. So it's a question of whether you'd be able to even take off any of these planes should you get them. And these are very, very expensive platforms, right? So it's not a question of like, let's buy it all. It's about prioritization. What do you buy? What do you not buy? And there's not been as much of a focus on smart mines, on long-range anti-ship missiles that could potentially thwart an invasion across the strait. So why is that? And I know this is a question that I've had discussions with congressmen here in the United States and other policymakers quite a bit. Why is Taiwan investing in these technologies that don't seem to have as much of an impact on their defense, and they're quite expensive, versus cheaper but also more numerous things that you could get that would better contribute to your defense? Is that because the military disagrees with that analysis fundamentally, or are they focused on the wrong things?
Well, I mean, the short answer to your question is that Taiwan is having a hard time sort of fitting a generational shift in strategic thinking into 5 years or less. And I'm not making excuses for Taiwan. I'm not making excuses for M&D, but this is the truth of the matter, is that there is a generational shift in military strategy that needs to take place, and in a very, very short period of time. And I think we're not fully there, and that has taken place, I think, that it has been challenging, to be honest, Dmitri. So I'll say it like this. If you look in the 1990s and before, we had the technological superiority in terms of our military. The PLA had aging Soviet planes. There was nobody serious that could ever fathom them putting together a legitimate and credible landing force against Taiwan. There was just no question that they would not. There was, I guess, no question that they would not achieve kind of air and naval superiority in the waters across Taiwan, particularly with U.S. support. And so that has been sort of the evolution of Taiwan's military over time, which is that we're going to maintain our technological edge. We're going to maintain kind of cutting edge hardware. We're going to go kind of toe to toe with the Chinese in terms of capabilities. Now that had rapidly started to change by the 2000s, when you saw the PLA's budget kind of skyrocket, when you saw military doctrine change, when you saw the reorganization into kind of regional areas, when you saw kind of a greater focus on joint force capabilities, when they started making investments in their Navy and Air Force and so forth. And the calculus has rapidly changed since, but Taiwan has not. And the reason is because if you look at the past two administrations from 2000 2008 and then 2008 to 2016, is that nobody took this threat of a PRC military threat seriously. So the military was allowed to essentially wither. Our GDP spending went from about 7% in the 70s and 80s to about like 2%, just over 2% in the 2000s, and then by 2010 around it was below 2% and 1.8%. We inherited.
So as the Chinese were ramping up their military spend as a percent of GDP, Taiwan's was going the opposite way.
Because our military had held on to this idea for decades that we've always had the military edge, number one, and then number two, that there just would not be war, and the PRC posed no threat, and they didn't change. Kind of this whole idea of what the PRC looked like and the threat matrix did not change, despite sort of actions that have taken place since the 2000s. And so in 2016, this is sort of the military we inherited, which is underfunded, underutilized, understaffed, that had just phased out conscription and frankly was a complete mess in terms of recruitment. And so that has sort of been the focus kind of in the initial stages, not necessarily on finding kind of a new strategic framework, but just on ensuring that we still had a functional military and ensuring that the budgets were being increased, ensuring that new hardware was coming in. So, and again, so that was sort of the background of what we faced.
And that's even the case, even though you've had, of course, military engagements with the PRC in the 50s. There was a real crisis and threat of invasion in the 90s during the so-called Third Taiwan Strait crisis. All of that was ignored just 5 years later, and people were still pretending that the threat was not there.
Exactly. And some of that was due to just not understanding threats. Some of this was due to political reasons. You have to keep in mind that the last administration before Tsai had come in had a very China-friendly approach. I mean, Ma Ying-jeou even engaged in a summit with Xi Jinping prior to him departing office in May 2016. And so there was a completely different political approach to China that necessitated this idea of a more peaceful military, development. But anyways, and then after Tsai took office, so you're engaged in increasing defense budget, blah 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 blah, and then this one person came along called Li Ximing, and Li Ximing was a Navy general that rose through the ranks and became Chief of General Staff. And so when he was Chief of General Staff, he took a look at the military and he said, hold on a second, what are we doing? Like, we're so far removed from kind of the threat matrix looks today, and we're so focused on what the threat matrix looked 30 years ago that we're no longer a capable force of defending Taiwan's sovereignty. And so he proposed this whole radical idea that we needed to disregard or deprioritize kind of heavy conventional equipment and capabilities that just did not make sense. So he was like, what do we need huge destroyers and frigates for? I mean, they're not survivable. What we need are smaller missile corvettes and that are nimble, agile, can disappear and come back and take one or two kind of heavier ships down. And then what we need instead of tanks are essentially, more urban trained infantry with kind of stingers and javelins, and they're able to function more independently. And what we need instead of, this huge air force are, effective strike missiles capable of doing, for example, anti-ship operations and again, that are survivable and nimble. And he's like, this is kind of the military we need, in the 21st century, in respect to our military objectives and consistent with our national security strategy. And then that proved too radical for many people within M&D, and that proved too radical for many of the generals that, came about in the earlier era of Taiwan holding this technological edge, blah, 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 blah. And so he, in a sense, was not exactly ousted, but ousted from his role. And that has been a disappointment, I guess, to many people that care about this issue. So anyways, my point being, I'm trying to be as forthright and honest in a sense that, like I said, I think we're moving in the right direction. I think everybody's on board. I think what we're lacking right now is the speed commensurate with the threat we face. And sort of
when you say everyone's on board, you're talking about the current government.
Politically. And I think...
But KMT is certainly not on board, right?
Well, M&D, I think, M&D has their considerations, and their considerations, okay, sorry, maybe I will, if you give me a bit more time, Dmitry, I'll share with you kind of M&D's considerations. And people find that they're not completely off whack, but it is true that there is some harmonization that needs to go on. So M&D believes that one of the threats we face right now is gray zone tactics. And M&D believes that, for example, we need fighter planes because we see great incursion of Chinese fighter jets in Taiwan's ADIZ. We need frigates because we need to ensure a blockade scenario. We're able to fight past a blockade scenario. We need all of this stuff because there's specific uses for it. What, Dmitry, you and I are focused on are kind of the invasion scenario that M&D also believes is a priority, but maybe not of a higher tier than kind of all these other gray zone scenarios that they envision, which include siege of offshore islands, blah, 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 blah. So again, the point is that I think politically, there is a consensus that the biggest threat we face is the existentialist one. But in terms of operationally, it's still challenging, and it will take time to bring everybody as in our generals and everybody fully on board with this. But it is a process that this administration is very committed to, and it is a process that is undergoing. And I will highlight one point, that this sort of challenge is not unique here to Taiwan. And one example is what's happening in the U.S. Marine Corps right now, which is Admiral Berger has made this idea that we don't need tanks, we don't need a lot of conventional weaponry, we don't need, but what we do need are kind of island hopping and agile, nimble, survivable assets. And even that sort of idea has attracted a lot of backlash.
It did, but I'll tell you this: he moved forward with this, and I think by the end of this year, the Marine Corps is basically not going to have many tanks at all. So this went very rapidly. And by the way, this was a general in this case, but we do in the United States have a pretty strong civilian control of our military. And ultimately, the budgets are being decided by the civilians in the Pentagon with advice, obviously, from the military. And I don't get that that's the same in Taiwan, right? I mean, obviously, conceptually, the president is in charge as a commander-in-chief, but it feels like the Ministry of Defense sometimes runs its own show, and that the civilian controls of the military are a little bit looser. Is that correct?
I mean, to a certain extent, we just don't have the same setup as the U.S. Like, there is no Office of the Secretary of Defense. That's staffed by political civilians that make political decisions, and then sort of have the services and the joint staff be in charge of operational decisions. Like, there is not that clear differentiation doesn't exist here in Taiwan. I mean, our military basically is the operational and the political policies are decided sort of within the same framework. So that, in a sense, is a bit more challenging compared to U.S. for making quick and rapid decisions or engaging in kind of major changes within the system. So, again, I highlighted the Berger comment, not because, again, I'm making excuses for time. I'm not. I've made very clear that the speed we're moving at needs to be a lot faster than it is today. What I am trying to say is that these difficulties exist. And whether, even in a system like the U.S. where you do have OSD, you still have retired kind of Marine Corps commandants come out and former defense secretaries say that, hey, this is not, you're moving in the wrong direction. You'll have pushback everywhere. Our pushback here in Taiwan will be a bit more intense simply because, again, we don't have sort of that OSD system that allows a clear differentiation between political objectives and military operational objectives. So, again, to this point, and I will draw a full circle here because I know our time is drawing close to an end, Dmitry, which is this. I think the Taiwan administration is moving in the right direction. I think there's a lot of impatience, and that's understandable. Ultimately, I mean, defense is our own responsibility in Taiwan. I don't think there's any serious Taiwanese person that is in charge of our national security or our foreign affairs that realistically believes that this is an obligation of the U.S. to help. I don't think that is the case, and I hope that is not the case. And my experience in government has shown me that is not the case. Defense is our responsibility. It would be great. It would be fantastic if our partners and allies around the world, show deterrence against China and support Taiwan in this. But ultimately, this is our job, and this is one job we're going to try to do right. Now, again, we're we're not disregarding the threat. Our GDP, our defense spending has increased by about 35% over the past 6 years alone, which is actually quite fast for a democratic society. We're making new purchases of, for example, asymmetric weaponry that are outside of just tanks or planes. I mean, we're purchasing CDCMs, coastal defense cruise missiles. There's a huge emphasis on the production of new Xiongfeng anti-ship missiles and so forth. And so there has been actions and moves in the right direction. We've reintroduced conscription of a year. The reserve training has been completely overhauled. We're no longer doing, for example, bayonet training. People are using simulators on javelins and stingers and so forth. So again, my point is it's not that we're not moving in the right direction. We are. It's the point is that maybe we need to move a bit faster based on the threat matrix we see, particularly based on the fact that Xi Jinping has made it a priority for the PLA to have the capabilities, not necessarily, a hard date in terms of invasion scenario, but at least the capabilities if he so chose to do so by 2027. So that's sort of the timeline we're running against. And so we're going to have to move a bit faster to move kind of in accordance to that sort of time frame we see.
Yeah. You mentioned, Vincent, the blockade scenarios, the gray zone tactics of incursions into air defense zones and so forth. And as you know, I've run a number of war games on Taiwan invasions, and my own sense is that those things are a little bit of a red herring because at the end of the day, China is either going to mobilize for invasion, which is going to take months. It's not going to be Xi Jinping waking up one day and ordering an invasion. We're going to see the buildup similar to what we saw in the buildup of Russian troops on the border of Ukraine. It took many months, and this is even more complex because obviously there's a very important naval component, potentially airborne paratrooper component, and so forth. And if you don't have that, if you just have these incursions and blockades, then their bluff is going to be called, and they're not going to be ready to move forward if they're challenged by Taiwan or the United States or maybe even Japan in conjunction with Japan, and it's not going to be successful. So in my sense of it is, and I'm curious if you agree, is that if you do have sort of the blockade or those types of scenarios emerging, it's going to be prelude to an invasion where the forces are already mobilized, they're prepared for an invasion, and maybe they start with a blockade to see if they can win the war without fighting, and if they don't, they move forward with an invasion. But the invasion is the ultimate thing that you have to worry about, not the blockade that will, basically make Taiwan fall without even being backed up by a threat of invasion. Do you agree with that?
I agree. I mean, I actually do agree because, I mean, that's the point I drew in earlier as well, which is that these may be valid scenarios, but the existentialist scenario is the invasion scenario. And I think we can approach this rationally as well, which is the point that if China is going to suffer all the consequences that they're going to suffer for engaging in a blockade or a surgical strike or any other gray zone kind of tactic that really, challenges Taiwan's stability and security, then they're going to suffer all the consequences anyway. So if they're going to suffer all the consequences, why not do it in a way that best leaves them 100% sure of them achieving their objectives, right? And so, a blockade may or may not succeed. A surgical strike may or may not succeed. Seizing offshore islands may or may not succeed. An invasion, if they so chose and had the confidence level, in their view, may have a higher chance of succeeding. So if you're going to suffer all the consequences anyway, why not just go all out?
Yeah.
I mean, Dmitri, none of us can replace Xi Jinping. I mean, nobody really knows what Xi is thinking. Like that's kind of the beauty of these communist systems.
Well, that's one of the things we learned last year is that you don't necessarily are going to have your enemy choose the best possible plan with regards to Putin invading Ukraine. Sometimes politics and internal dynamics of the regime may intervene, and they'll choose an option that's not necessarily the smartest.
But you make the preparations for the worst case scenario. And so I think that's precisely what needs to take place here in Taiwan, is that preparation for a worst case scenario.
All right, last question, Vincent. This podcast is listened by people all over the world, but primarily it's an American podcast, listened a lot by people here in D.C. and around the country. What is at stake for America here? Obviously, you're a Taiwan patriot. You've got family on the island. I understand why you and your compatriots want to fight and defend the island. And obviously, we care about democracy. We care about people's freedoms, but we're not sending our troops to fight in Ukraine. We're not sending our troops to fight in lots of places where democracy may be challenged or human rights are being violated, let's say in Yemen and elsewhere. What is at stake, do you think, for Americans and American national security if Taiwan falls to China, in terms of our regional influence, in terms of our relationship with allies, in terms of our ability to have presence in this most important, economically most important region of the world? Paint that picture for us.
So I'm very sympathetic and understanding of this idea that the American people have been told that every single conflict is a threat to their national security, and various ways have been found to justify U.S. intervention in Vietnam, to justify U.S. intervention in kind of the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and all of these interventions have been posed as hindering this essential threat to the American way of life, and ultimately none of them have really panned out and been consistent to what sort of these original arguments were. So it's, I think, understandable to a certain degree when people disagree with this idea that a fall of Taiwan would hugely change sort of the American peace framework that has, not the American, I guess just international order that has existed since the Second World War, but certainly the U.S. has played a major part in upholding, but that it would also pose this direct security threat to the U.S. So I understand when people don't necessarily see it that way. But I will say this, the PRC poses a threat like we've never seen before in the history of, I would say, of modern development, in a sense that the Soviet Union never reached economic parity with the U.S. China will, at one point or another, reach economic parity with the U.S. In fact, in terms of purchasing power parity, maybe it has already reached that level. Nobody has posed an essentialist threat sort of to the post-Second World War kind of framework as China does right now. I would say even Russia does not pose that same level of urgency and challenge to the international framework that has governed kind of interactions between countries since the Second World War. No country really has, no challenge really has emerged like China in terms of disinformation, in terms of hybrid warfare, in terms of gray zone tactics, in terms of undermining democracies, as China has done, together with growing sophisticated technologies to do so since the Second World War. So, I mean, all of this combines to this idea that I think it's fully justified through the evidence we have that China dominating half of the world is just it's just going to alter the sort of rest of the world forever, and that if people are okay with communism, with the PRC, maybe not even communism, with just an authoritarian dictatorship dominating the Indo-Pacific region, dominating maybe 60-70% of trade around the world, dominating critical technology, dominating venues of disinformation and affecting democratic discourse, and essentially dominating this idea that maybe in a discussion of authoritarianism versus democracy, authoritarianism wins, then by all means, then China maybe in that view isn't so much a threat. But I think rational people will see otherwise. And so, Dmitri, I have a hard time sort of saying this in a way that, because I'm talking to an audience that doesn't live 130 miles from China and is in many ways very much divorced from the threat. But I will say, I will say through a personal perspective, that we live under this threat every day, and that we live under the threat of disinformation. We live under the threat of hybrid tactics. We live under the threat of them affecting our democratic discourse, funding ways of undermining our democracy. We live under the threat of hundreds of missiles pointed directly at us, at my family, at my children. And I don't want to wish this on anybody else. You know, I fundamentally believe that if the Chinese were able to achieve their objectives on Taiwan, we will see a next step, and we will see a step after that. And we will see these steps that ultimately, I think, pose a fundamental challenge to our way of life everywhere in the world, in democracies.
But in terms of immediate steps, if Taiwan gets conquered by China, that will alter the region immediately, right? A lot of the allies that we have in the region that are hardcore allies for us, like Japan and so forth, will find ways to try to accommodate a new, much bigger power that would have just emerged. Would you agree with that?
Well, like I said, I mean, it completely undermines the U.S. framework that's been built up since the Second World War, right? I mean, you have U.S. Allies here in the region. You have Korea, you have Japan, you have the Philippines, you have others that would immediately find U.S. credibility and legitimacy undermined here, and maybe it would cause political decisions that are unforeseen right now. But again, like, I'm trying to speak from a perspective that like, these are the people like you and I that work in policy that see these things, but how does this impact everyday Americans? And I've been trying to articulate that, maybe unsuccessfully, but my point being is that U.S. intervention, U.S. potential support for Taiwan is outside kind of a small closed-door decision-making circle. I think it very much ultimately will involve sort of American public's discourse on this issue, and I hope to espouse this in a way that the American public feels and understands sort of the threat that China poses to us, but the threat China poses to all of us around the world. And it's very real, and it's there, and it's not just the concept of civilization. It's already taking place here in Taiwan, but also in Australia, also in other countries around the world. And that's not something we want to see, encouraged. And so the best way, again, Dmitri, and you and I both know this, and we've spoken about this before, the best way isn't to take action after war breaks out. The best way is to take action now. And so, again, it's up to us. It's our responsibility, our defense, our way of life that we need to protect. But ultimately, it is also something that affects everyday Americans. And so if the more we can do now and to stave off an invasion scenario, I think the best end result will be. And so, again, I don't want to see war. We're doing everything we can right now to avoid war, not to actually engage in war. But to do so, we need to make sacrifices here in Taiwan, most preeminently, but also, I think countries need to make decisions around the world about how much they're willing to do on Taiwan. And that decision should come ideally before the conflict starts rather than after conflict breaks out.
Very well said, Vincent. Thank you so much for coming on the show. As you know, I've run a number of these war games looking at the implications of invasion, how it might unfold. And it all reminds me of a 1983 movie, War Games, with Matthew Broderick. I'm not sure if you've seen it. A long time ago, where you had a supercomputer that is almost launching a thermonuclear war and realizes at the very end, by being forced to play tic-tac-toe, that the only winning move is not to play, for both sides to stand down. And it strikes me that that's really the only solution here in this crisis, is to make sure that China is deterred from invading Taiwan, because if it moves forward with that invasion, it'll be a catastrophe for Taiwan, for China, for America, and really for the whole world. It truly could be another world war that will be devastating in terms of lives, economic impact, and massive destruction of property and so forth. So thank you so much for your insights. It's great to understand how the Taiwanese people and politicians are thinking about this. I'm sure our audience will find it very valuable.
Thank you, Dmitri. I'm always happy to end these podcasts on a happy and optimistic note. But thank you, Dmitri, for drawing attention on this issue. Thank you.
Take care.